Lots of video from body-worn camera and dash cam footage from the police car. And at the end of that second manoeuvre, the car moving back into the police car, Martyn Blake, the firearms officer who'd run round to the front of Chris Kaba's car, opened fire, shot Chris Kaba once through the windscreen. A bullet entered his head and he died. Now, the prosecution had argued that there was no reason for Martyn Blake, the firearms officer, to use his gun. Mr. Blake said, contrarily, that he felt that the car was moving in a way that was putting his colleagues in danger. He said he was filled with dread. He thought that one of his colleagues was about to die, was about to go under the wheels of that car. His intention, he said, was to incapacitate the driver and to stop the car. The prosecutor had said that the jury might want to consider that the officer had become frustrated, angry and annoyed that Mr. Kaba, during those 17 seconds of confrontation, had refused to obey police shouts to stop and to raise his hands. Mr. Blake, when he gave his evidence, said very firmly that he hadn't been any of those things, angry, annoyed or frustrated. He simply wanted to stop a vehicle that he said was being used to escape from the boxing in by the police cars, and he thought that one of his colleagues was about to get killed. Now, the jury only went out just before lunch today, so they've taken barely more than 3 hours to come to that verdict. Chris Kaba's parents have sat throughout this trial. His father particularly, I think, has sat through every day. And I think they will, well, let's see what they say. But they came here 3 weeks ago looking for justice, looking for answers. They couldn't understand on the night that their son was killed why the police officer had decided to open fire. They felt that there was no need to do that. But now they have got justice of some sort. Let's see whether they feel that they really have got justice. We hope that we might hear something from them as they leave court. We're also going to hear from the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, Sir Mark Rowley. He said that he will speak at the end of this trial. When the officer was charged a year ago with murder, Sir Mark Rowley went on the record saying that he felt there was a need for his officers, when they use lethal force, as they do, as Martyn Blake did on this occasion, that they need more legal protection. Now, he didn't amplify exactly what he thought the remedy for that would be. Again, we might hear more from Sir Mark Rowley a little later today.
Yeah, and as you say, Martyn, we are expecting to hear from the Metropolitan Police following the conclusion of this trial, Chris, into the shooting of Chris Kaba, that Metropolitan Police firearms officer. Martyn Blake found not guilty of the murder of Chris Kaba. And now, Martyn, I know that you have been following this trial. As you say, the jury didn't take very long to come to this verdict. The prosecution case suggested that the lethal force perhaps did not need to be used. When asked about this, the firearms officer, what was the response from Mr. Blake?
He said that he was filled with dread. The car had moved forward and slammed into the cars in front of it. The car then reversed back into a police car that had drawn up behind it. He feared that the car was going to keep moving to try to escape from being boxed in by the police cars. He thought if it moved again, there was a huge danger of it hitting one of his colleagues. There were a number of firearms officers around the car, something like, well, at least 8, moving in different directions, all of those armed officers. Mr. Blake felt that one of them was in severe danger, and that's why he opened fire. The prosecutor said, you intended to kill the driver. He said, no, I didn't intend to kill him. I merely shot to incapacitate him, so that would stop the car. Now, a number of the other firearms officers who were on duty involved in this incident at the time gave evidence, principally for the prosecution, but a couple of them, when they were cross-examined by Mr. Kaba's defence, said that they too, at least one of them said, that he was about to fire into the car if Mr. Blake, Martyn Blake, hadn't. And another of those firearms officers on the scene involved in this confrontation said that he had never himself felt in such danger on an armed operation as he did at that point. The prosecutor did, when he was questioning Martyn Blake, did say, well, the videos showed, and there was lots of video shown to the jury, he said the video rather counters what you, Martyn Blake, was saying, how you shouted, "Armed police, let me see your hands." The prosecutor said, the videos don't show that. You can't hear you shouting that. The response from Martyn Blake was that, well, that's part of our training, to shout whenever we raise our carbines, but I can't be sure that I did. The prosecutor also picked up Martyn Blake on something else that he'd said. The prosecutor said, well, the video doesn't show that the car was moving at great speed. In fact, said the prosecutor, the car never reached a speed more than 12 miles per hour as it was moving backwards and forwards, trying to escape. Well, said Martyn Blake, that's how it felt to me at the time.
And as we say, the jury have found Martyn Blake not guilty. Now, Chris Kaba was 24 when he was shot and killed on the 5th of September 2022. Martyn, what more do we know about Mr. Kaba?
Well, we know the police didn't know who was driving that car that night. We know that he was 24. He was driving a car that police suspected had been connected with a shooting the night before in Brixton nearby. There was intelligence to suggest that the Audi Q8, quite a high-end car, had some connection with that shooting. So it was a suspect car. It had been flagged up in the morning briefings at the Metropolitan Police. So all of those officers who were eventually part of that convoy that was following the car through South London just before it was boxed in and stopped, they all knew that it was a suspect car. That's about as much as they knew. They didn't know who was driving it. That much was made clear by the prosecution.
Now, of course, Martyn, as we say, this shooting happened back in September of 2022. Now, of course, October 2024, and there was some delay, wasn't there, Martyn, in the process of this, for this trial to get to court, and also there was a lot of discussion and requests to have the firearms officer involved in this, Martyn Blake, have his name released to the public.
Yes, I mean, there was a court battle before the trial began, after Martyn Blake had been charged. He was charged about a year ago, so the shooting happened 2 years ago. Within a year he was charged, and then another year before this trial started. And that's not really a long time when you think about previous occasions where police officers have faced legal action. I should say that for a police firearms officer to be put on trial for murder is a pretty rare thing. Martyn Blake is only the fourth police marksman who killed somebody on duty to face a murder charge, and none of those previous officers who went on trial for murder were found guilty, so they've all been acquitted. But there was this big issue about whether he should be named having been charged. I mean, in most cases where people are charged with serious offences, they are named, so everybody knows who's about to stand trial. Martyn Blake and his lawyers put up a big battle, and for a long time he was known only as by the cipher NX121. I mean, all of those officers involved in the operation on the night had similar code names, if you like. His persisted for most of the time he was waiting to go on trial, but a few months ago a successful legal argument managed to have his name, his code lifted, and we were finally able to name Martyn Blake as the officer who'd been charged with murder. But that's about all we have been allowed to tell you about him. We can also tell you that he's aged 40. He was a member of the Metropolitan Police Firearms Unit, and that's about it. We were banned from showing any images, if we had them, of him, any still photographs, any moving footage of him. And of course, each day when he's been coming into the Old Bailey, we've seen nothing of him. He's been brought into the building through some side entrance. But even if we were to see him and film him, we've been prevented from showing that.
Martyn, just on Martyn Blake then, do we know during this period he was, I presume, suspended from the Metropolitan Police? Do we know what happens to that officer now going forward, now that he has been found not guilty?
He was eventually suspended. I mean, initially he was taken off firearms duties. Well, I think most people would understand that was a very sensible thing to do. I mean, that happened immediately in the aftermath of the shooting. Then he was suspended, and there may be another process yet, because as well as being charged with murder, he was, and that resulted from an investigation by the police watchdog, the Office for Independent Office for Police Conduct. So they, in effect, brought about this prosecution with the Crown Prosecution Service. And the IOPC, the police watchdog, will now tell us, I hope today, whether they are concerned by anything that emerged during this trial enough to, although Martyn Blake's been acquitted of murder, whether there is anything to suggest that he should still face some kind of disciplinary charge, as many officers do. So we wait to hear from the IOPC about whether there will be any further action. But at the moment, Martyn Blake has been acquitted of murder and is a free man.
Okay. Martyn Brunt, outside the Old Bailey, I just thank you for that. I just want to bring viewers the latest that we have coming in from the CPS Special Crime and Counter-Terrorism Division, the head of which, Frank Ferguson, has issued a statement in the last few minutes. I'm going to read it to you in full. It says, "First and foremost, I want to say that my thoughts and those of the CPS remain with the family of Chris Kaba. Today, armed Metropolitan Police Officer Martyn Blake has been found not guilty of the charge of murder. We fully respect the jury's decision. This has been a complex and sensitive case, and the decision to prosecute was made after an in-depth consideration of all the available evidence. We recognise that firearms officers operate under enormous pressure, but it is our responsibility to put cases before a jury that meet our tests for prosecution, and we are satisfied that test was met in this case. It is therefore right that the case was put before the jury for them to scrutinise and to decide. They have carefully considered each piece of evidence, including video and Martyn Blake's own account. They have made up their minds in the proper way, and we thank them for doing so." That is Frank Ferguson, head of the CPS Special Crime and Counter-Terrorism Division, with a statement following the conclusion of the trial into Martyn Blake, charged with the murder of Chris Kaba, Martyn Blake, has been found not guilty of that murder. Our crime correspondent, Martyn Brunt, is still with us. And Martyn, look, the CPS there, with that statement, first of all, thanking the family, giving their thoughts, to the family of Chris Kaba, and then explaining their decision to bring forward this prosecution. What do you make of the CPS explaining the decision to prosecute?
Well, I think they were always going to be expected to say something like that. The idea that, the decision to charge him, as I said earlier, it's a rare thing for a police marksman who shoots somebody on duty to face a murder charge. It very rarely ends up in a trial like this. So I think it was incumbent on the Crown Prosecution Service to give some explanation as to why they took that rare decision. And I'm just looking at the statement now. They said it had been a complex and sensitive case, an in-depth consideration of all the available evidence. We recognise that the firearms officers operate under enormous pressure, but it is our responsibility to put cases before a jury that meet our test for prosecution. I didn't really expect the Crown Prosecution Service to say anything other than that. We are going to hear from, I'm sure, a number of other organisations now, not least the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, Sir Mark Rowley. He said at the time of Martyn Blake's charging decision that there was a need in his mind for his officers who use lethal force to be given more legal protection, was the phrase that he used. He didn't really explain what he meant by that. Perhaps we'll hear something more of the detail of what exactly he has in mind. And certainly firearms officers generally will agree with that. I mean, a lot of them were aghast at the decision to charge Martyn Blake, so much so that some of them were threatening to hand in their ticket, as they call it. Firearms officers are all volunteers, so if you're a police officer, you volunteer to carry a gun with all the huge responsibilities that come with it, and you don't get paid any extra for doing so. So a lot of officers resented the idea that one of their colleagues, who in their eyes was merely doing his duty, protecting those around him, should not only face a charge, but face the ultimate, the most serious charge of murder. They were threatening to hand in their weapons. I'm not sure if any of them did. I mean, they have in the past when similar occasions have arisen where, as I said before, 3 police firearms officers in the past have faced murder charges. And one in particular, 20 years or so ago, did lead to quite a lot of firearms officers handing in their weapons. Now, if Martyn Blake had been found guilty, I think that there was a likelihood that officers would decide no longer to carry firearms officers, and that would have been could have provoked a real crisis within the Metropolitan Police. They have something like 2,500 trained armed officers, but to lose a good deal of them would cause a real problem. I don't think with the result that we've had today, the not guilty verdict, that's going to happen. I don't think anybody will be tempted to hand in and make that kind of process today. But the debate about firearms officers facing potential court action like this will rumble on. As I said, at the forefront of that will be the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, Sir Mark Rowley, who we're going to hear from sometime soon.
We are awaiting that news conference from the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, Sir Mark Rowley, and we'll bring it to you as soon as we can. But Martyn, look, sticking with you just for a moment,
okay.
Chris Kaba, of course, the age of 24, driving this vehicle that had been flagged by the police database as believed to have been involved in a shooting incident the day before, was unarmed. There was no gun found, no weapon found in the vehicle in which he was travelling in. What was the feeling in court when Martyn Blake was giving evidence? It is interesting that you, as you point out, that there were some firearms officers who gave evidence for the prosecution who had also said that they were about to unload their weapons at the moment that Blake did.
Really?
Martyn, if you can still hear me.
Sorry.
All right, well, look, Martyn, let's just step away from Martyn for a moment. This story, as we say, the news is just breaking that Martyn Blake, a former Metropolitan Police firearms officer, found not guilty of the murder of 24-year-old Chris Kaba on the 5th of September 2022. Our crime correspondent, Martin Brunt, is at the Old Bailey, where the jury has just returned that verdict. We'll go back to him later on this afternoon, but for now I want to get a policing perspective and bring in our policing commentator, Graham Wetton, for his reaction to all of this. Graham Wetton, it's good to speak with you this afternoon. The verdict of not guilty, your reaction?
Obviously, I'm relieved for the officer. It's sad that anybody loses their life, and especially in an interaction with a serving police officer in the line of duty. I think within policing there was genuine shock and surprise. It was a charge of murder that was first put to the officer. I'm relieved now that he's been found not guilty. A jury has heard all the evidence. They've been properly directed by a judge and have come to the conclusion that he's not guilty of murder. So there's some relief there. There's still some concerns within policing, though, and I think the Commissioner alluded to this, and you've mentioned this in the last piece with Martyn, about officers do need some legal protection. They are carrying out their duty. They are carrying out an essential and dangerous role, not just in London, but across the streets of the country. This case has been watched by armed officers across the country to see what the outcome was. So it wasn't just a possible impact on armed policing within London, it was across the country, because officers daily go out with firearms. They confront and deal with criminals, and quite often violent criminals and potentially armed criminals. So they need to know they're going to get supported if they have to pull their firearm and then, sadly, pull the trigger to use that lethal force. And it's based on an honestly held belief at the time that they have to do that based on all the circumstances and the facts they have in literally seconds to make a decision. The court has pored over all the decisions over a couple of weeks. The officer had literally seconds to make that judgment call as to what he had to do. It's a really challenging job. It's a dangerous job, as you've heard some of the officers' testimony. They were all in fear of their lives and livelihood. A vehicle is a potentially lethal weapon. It has to be treated as such.
Graham, look, as you say, you were surprised it was a murder charge that Martyn Blake faced. But if we just look at the facts of the matter on that particular evening, Chris Kaba was driving this vehicle. The vehicle had been flagged, but Chris Kaba himself was not a suspect in any crime, and he was unarmed and then was shot in their head. Is that normal practice to incapacitate a person, to shoot them in the head?
I think, well, when you're shooting in a windscreen of a vehicle, I think it's probably difficult to differentiate between head and torso. You're firing towards the largest mass from behind through a windscreen, through a steering wheel. They weren't sure who was in the car, so it was the car that activated the police national computers, being concerned in the shooting the night before. So it's still very recent. So within 24 hours of the actual shooting taking place. So when you're actually facing that vehicle, you're not sure whether the firearm is still in the vehicle. You don't know who you're facing, who it is behind the wheel, and whether they've got the capacity there to use a firearm that's still there, potentially in the vehicle, because you don't know at that point. You haven't searched the vehicle. You haven't been inside it. So you're not actually sure how lethal the threat is you are facing in those seconds, be it from the car or from the individual inside the vehicle. So it's a judgment call at the time, made on the facts that the officers are aware of in seconds.
Now, Graham, if you just hold on for me a moment, I want to bring viewers the latest that we have come into us from the Independent Office of Police Conduct, the IOPC. They have issued a quite lengthy statement following this verdict. I just want to read most of it to you, and then, Graham, I'm going to get your response off the bat, so just bear with me for a moment if you can. It's from Amanda Rowe, the IOPC director, and it begins, firstly, we want to acknowledge Chris Kaba's family and friends today as they continue to grieve his death more than 2 years on. Our thoughts and sympathies remain with them and everyone else who has been affected. The past few weeks must have been incredibly difficult and distressing for Chris's family, who have sat through the trial, listened to all the evidence and witnessed his final moments played out in court. We also recognise the impacts that this trial has had on the officer involved, as well as his firearms colleagues and the wider policing community. Today, a jury, having considered all the evidence, has acquitted Police Sergeant Martyn Blake of murder. We appreciate this trial will have been a significant public interest, and particularly so within our black communities. The IOPC's role is to independently investigate the circumstances surrounding a fatal police shooting, including the decision to use lethal force. Under the law, firearms officers can use lethal force. However, it must be reasonable in the circumstances the officer honestly believed them to be. The decisions to criminally investigate Sergeant Blake and then to refer the case to the CPS followed careful consideration of a significant amount of evidence gathered during our independent investigation and by applying the relevant legal tests which govern our work. Following the CPS decision to charge, the matter has now been heard in open court and the officer has accounted for his actions before a jury. Ultimately, it is that jury's decision, having carefully considered all the evidence, to determine guilt or innocence, and we respect that decision and thank them for their consideration. Armed policing plays a crucial part in protecting our communities and keeping the public safe from danger. Firearms officers can and do find themselves in extremely dangerous and volatile situations where they are forced to make difficult and quick decisions under intense pressure. It is important to recognise that fatal police shootings are rare, particularly in relation to the volume of incidents of firearms officers are called to attend. And it is rarer still that they result in criminal or misconduct proceedings for the officer who fired the fatal shot. Over the past 10 years, the IOPC, as our predecessor, has undertaken the 26 investigations into fatal police shootings. In one other case, we referred a file to the CPS to consider a criminal charge for the officer who fired the shot. Now, Graham, that is the IOPC who opened an investigation, of course, as is their duty when a police officer discharges a firearm, and of course when an individual is killed by an officer, into what happened on that night on the 5th of September. Reiterating, as you had said, that armed policing is a very challenging job, but the questions will remain for many, not least for Chris Kaba's friends and families, to why he was fatally shot in this stop by officers.
Yeah, I think that's been explained in his testimony, and also the other officers at the scene. In their training, they are taught to fire towards the largest target. So in the vehicle, you're firing towards whoever is behind the steering wheel. So you're firing towards the largest target. It's probably difficult at the time, if it's dark, it's in the side street, etc., to actually identify. Police officers can't just pick, it's not like the movies or Hollywood. They fire towards the largest target, which in that case is the body mass. So sadly, one shot fired and it was fatal. But the officer at the time honestly held belief, and the IOPC statement does actually cover almost everything that's come out in the trial.
Graham, then, just finally to pick up on the point that you had made briefly and Martyn was making as well about those other firearms officers who had been watching on from this, where does this decision, this jury verdict, leave some of those individuals? Are you expecting to hear from Sir Mark Rowley later on today with sort of more detail about that particular part of policing?
Yeah, I would. I think the Commissioner is likely, maybe not today, maybe he'll give it some time. But I think the point he made previously about they need greater protection within the law, greater clarity within the law as to use of force, honestly held belief. My understanding is as soon as the announcement was made that Sergeant Blake was being charged with murder and then suspended, etc., there were a number of officers that handed in their authority to carry firearms, and there was an additional number of officers that asked to be taken off operational firearms duties. So they moved to almost like non-operational roles. So they would still carry a firearm, but in almost like protection type roles. So it has had an impact already on armed policing. I think there are other officers across the country, not just within London, that were waiting to see today's verdict, because we didn't just have an officer charged with murder, but for quite a rare occurrence as well, he was named prior to the trial. So his identity was out before the trial. His name is now out there. Everybody knows who it is that's been charged with murder, and now, by a jury, has been acquitted of it.
OK. Graham Wetton, our policing commentator, appreciate your expertise this afternoon. Thank you so much for that. Let's go back to Martyn Brunt now, our crime correspondent, who is outside the Old Bailey. Martyn, of course, you were in court when that guilty verdict was handed down. That not guilty verdict was handed down, sorry.
I was, and very quickly after that, we've had statements from a number of organisations, and we expect more. The Metropolitan Police Federation, I'm sure, will want to give us their views. There's the Firearms Officers Association. They too will have a view. We've heard from, in the last few minutes, from the IOPC and the CPS, very keen to make the point that police are not above the law, and the use of lethal force has to be investigated, and on these very rare occasions, as they've argued, can lead to a prosecution. We can show you now some of the footage that was shown during this 3-week trial, some of the stuff that the jury saw. And there's a warning, my report does contain IOPC, the police watchdog, footage of the final moments before Chris Kaba was killed.
On to New Park Road, continuing southbound, and past, what's your ETA? 30 seconds.
Through South London, a convoy of police cars followed the suspect's Audi Q8. It had been linked to a shooting the night before.
Standing by for strikes, stand by, stand by.
When it turned into a side street, police launched a plan to stop it and remove the driver.
On to Coastal Gardens. Do it here, it's in line.
Boxed in, surrounded by armed police, the Audi rammed forwards.
Oh, police! Show me your hand!
Officers' body-worn cameras and dash cams caught the speed, the noise and the drama of what was happening.
Watch yourself.
The suspect's Audi drove backwards.
Mind them, he's going to try and go.
After 17 seconds, an officer fired one shot. The jury was shown a graphics version of the movement of the firearms officers. Blake is the yellow dot. He ends up in front of the suspect's car, from where he takes the final shot. The officer said he feared the car would hit and kill one of his colleagues. He shot the driver in the forehead and killed him. The suspect was Chris Kaba, 24 and about to be a father. It wasn't his car. There was no weapon inside it. The next day, as police investigated the shooting, Mr. Kaba's distraught family went to the scene.
The report said that it was a pursuit. Where was the pursuit? He was boxed in. The pursuit where? You know, and why did they shoot him in his vehicle with the windows up? I don't get it.
Police!
In London and elsewhere, campaigners looked for an explanation. The superstar rapper Stormzy joined a demonstration outside Scotland Yard. 2 years later, Mr. Kaba's parents were at the Old Bailey to watch their son's killer in the dock. A rare thing, the firearms officer charged with murder. A court ban on his image, but not his name, Martyn Blake, aged 40. In court, the prosecutor said the officer had no reason to fire his gun. He'd given false statements and exaggerated the danger. Mr. Kaba, said the prosecutor, had ignored police shouts to stop, and that made the officer angry, frustrated and annoyed. The officer told the jury he felt none of that. He was filled with dread, he said, because the driver was trying to use his car to escape. He thought one of his colleagues was about to die, so he fired to incapacitate the driver and stop the car. In the wake of the Chris Kaba shooting, the Met Commissioner, Sir Mark Rowley, called for better legal protection for officers who use force on duty.
They are subject to the law like everyone else. There shouldn't be a double standard. I know the Commissioner's talking about extra protection for arms officers, but that, again, is sending the wrong signal. You cannot have one law for one set of people and another law for others. It has to be consistent.
Tony Long is one of 4 on-duty officers in recent times to be tried for murder or manslaughter. He shot dead a suspect in North London nearly 20 years ago. He was acquitted.
We ask those police officers to look after us. And so if we train them to use these varying degrees of force, ending up potentially with lethal force, then I think we should be not cutting them some slack, but we should have a better understanding. And you can't just automatically say, well, that police officer shot someone.
The jury has delivered its verdict on the shooting of Chris Kaba, but the debate over the police use of lethal force will continue. There'll naturally be huge relief over this not guilty verdict from Martyn Blake himself, the officer who fired that fatal shot. But his colleagues at the Metropolitan Police, particularly those who worked alongside him in the firearms unit and continue to do that job. But I think policing around the country will be relieved that this has resulted in the officer's acquittal. Now, as for Chris Kaba's family, well, they arrived here just over 3 weeks ago for the start of the trial, telling us that they were here to see justice done, to look for answers. We hope sometime in the next hour or so, now that this not guilty verdict has come in, that we'll get some reaction from them to that verdict.
As soon as we get it from the family possibly, and of course from Sir Mark Rowley when he speaks. All right, Martin Brunt, outside the Old Bailey, thank you for that. Let's bring in now Dal Banu, former Chief Superintendent with the Met, for his reaction to all of this. Good afternoon to you, Dal. The verdict of not guilty for this police officer, your response?
Well, I'm not surprised. I think murder is malice aforethought. It's premeditated. It's a high bar. So I think it would have been extremely surprising if the jury had convicted the police officer of the charge of murder.
And Dal, we heard in Martin's report there, and obviously from Graham as well, about this consideration now of firearms officers and receiving some kind of extra protection. What's your sense of that, as to whether that is something that firearms officers need to be considered? I mean, we heard Leroy Logan talking about there not needing to be another level of justice for police who carry guns.
Well, I think this trial has actually showed that the juries, once the evidence is presented to them, will look at the evidence, look at and the footage that you saw that Martin shared with us, that was shown in court, shows quite a frightening scene. And we know that the vehicle, you heard that the vehicle had a marker on it, a PNC marker, which basically was led to automatic number plate reader, so that there was intelligence around this vehicle being involved in a firearms incident. There was an attempt to stop the vehicle. Chris Kaba was driving the vehicle, and it's obviously very, very sad that there's a loss of life. You saw from the footage that Martin has shown us now, it was very, very clear that there was a concerted effort by Chris Kaba to get away. He was driving into police vehicles, he was reversing into police vehicles, and trying to break his way through there. What the police officer has said is that he felt his colleague's life was in danger, and he then he fired a weapon. I think it's probably worth putting into context how rare it is for police to use firearms. In all my time as a firearms commander, none of my officers ever shot anybody ever discharged a firearm. Out of 18,000 incidents, shots were fired on 4 occasions.
Okay. Dalbab, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but we've run short of time this hour. Thank you for being with us. We'll continue our coverage of the news that the Police Sergeant Martyn Blake has been found not guilty of the murder of Chris Kaba. More in the next hour.
The most significant day of this conflict.
They keep telling us that they want aid.
And this is what's left of it.
Heavy vehicle.
Why only in America?
People want their country to work.
You want a job in a normal life.
Why are these homes empty?
I want you to be honest with people.
That has happened within minutes.
Sky News, the full story first. Free wherever you get your news.
There's always more to the news than a headline. We want to discover, to delve a little deeper, to find out what's really going on. Explanation, analysis, the people at the heart of every story. I'm Neil Patterson, and this is the Sky News Daily Podcast. So, by the end, we'll hopefully all understand what's going on in the world just that little better. Available wherever you get your podcasts.
It's 5 o'clock. I'm Mark Austin. This is the News Hour. 60 minutes of news, analysis and interviews. We begin right now with the top stories this hour. Breaking news, a police firearms officer charged with murdering Chris Kaba is found not guilty. The 24-year-old was shot dead through the windscreen of the car he was driving following a police chase. The officer, Martyn Blake, told the jury he was only trying to stop the car, which police suspected had been used in a crime the night before. And this is the scene at News Scotland Yard this evening, where we are expecting a statement from the Met Commissioner, Sir Mark Rowley, and we will bring you that as soon as we get it. Good evening. We begin with breaking news, and in the past hour, a Metropolitan Police firearms officer charged with murdering Chris Kaba has been found not guilty. Martyn Blake fatally shot the 24-year-old in Streatham, south-east London, in September 2022 after the Audi he was driving was pursued in connection with a shooting the previous evening. Our crime correspondent, Martin Brunt, joins me now from outside the Old Bailey. And Martin, a lengthy trial. You've been following it throughout. Bring us up to date.
Well, it was a long trial, over 3 weeks, but it didn't take the jury very long to reach its decision. They started their deliberations just before lunch, and it took them, little more than 3 hours. 4 hours if you include the hour they were deliberating over lunch. The prosecution argument had been pretty basic, that the officer hadn't had any justification for using his weapon. The officer himself countered that by saying, well, he had felt...
And Martin, we're going to interrupt you. We are going to Scotland Yard and Smart Rowley.
Justice. And today, after 2 weeks of evidence, 12 men and women have cleared Sergeant Martyn Blake of murder. Over the past 2 years, Sergeant Blake has paid a huge personal and professional sacrifice. And this has been an incredibly difficult time for him and his family, and he has acted with professionalism and dignity throughout. This case has had an enormous impact on many. Chris Kaba's family and friends continue to grieve the loss of a loved one, and today will be enormously difficult for them. Today's verdict is significant. No firearms officer sets out on duty intent on ending a life. Their sole purpose is the complete opposite: the protection and the preservation of life. Throughout the trial, the jury heard significant detail about the scenes facing Sergeant Blake that night. They were told that the car Mr. Kaba was driving had been linked to a reported shooting the night before. The suspects were still at large, and no gun had been recovered. Armed officers bravely intervened, not knowing the risks that they were about to face. The court heard that Mr. Kaba tried to evade police, ramming his vehicle into others all around him. Sergeant Blake made a split-second decision on what he believed was necessary to protect his colleagues and to protect London. The jury decided that was an honestly held belief and that the force used was reasonable. Any fatal use of force understandably prompts huge concern amongst communities, particularly in black communities where trust in policing is low. There remains much for us to do to strengthen confidence in our service, and we know incidents like this place further strain on already challenged relationships. No police officer is above the law, but we have been clear that the system holding police to account is broken. I worry about the lack of support officers face for doing their best. But most of all, I worry for the public. The more we crush the spirit of good officers, the less they can fight crime. That risks London becoming less safe. Our armed officers respond to more than 4,000 incidents each year, but there are only 1 or 2 incidents where shots are fired. It is undeniable that they are the most professional, most accountable, and most cautious in their use of lethal force in the world. Their operations have prevented countless acts of violence across our city. Last year alone, they removed more than 400 guns from our streets. I remain humbled and deeply proud of officers who continue to protect London despite all the risks that they face. They continue to have my full and my unwavering support. Thank you.
Well, there we are. That was Sir Mark Rowley speaking after this verdict in court. The police marksman who fatally shot Chris Kaba has been cleared of the murder. And Sir Mark Rowley saying there that Chris Kaba's family is grieving and we think of them. But he said no officer sets out to take life. The car involved, he said, was involved in a crime with also what police thought was a gun involved. Sergeant Blake made a split-second decision and the jury decided the force used was reasonable, said Sir Mark Rowley. He said that we know incidents like this place further strain on policing relationships. But he went on to say the more we crush the spirit of officers, the less we can fight crime. And he described his force as the most professional force in the world, or one of the most professional forces in the world, and said that he was humbled and proud of his officers, and they have his full support. Our crime correspondent, Martyn Blake, we were speaking to him just a moment ago. He is outside the Old Bailey. And Martyn, before we speak more about this trial, just a word, if you heard it, on what Sir Mark Rowley had to say.
I didn't hear it terribly clearly, but I think that was much as we expected. I'm sure the Commissioner is very relieved, delighted even at that verdict, particularly, I think, the speed with which the jury decided that Martyn Blake was not guilty. The Commissioner talking about the difficult decisions that officers have to take. Split second was the phrase that he used. Acknowledging that it's a very, very difficult job that officers do, and also, of course, broadening the argument a little to talk about his recognition that support for officers is low within the black community, talking about how crushing it can be for officers to face low support, but also making the point and giving some examples of the job they do in countering violence in London, talking about last year something like 400 guns were removed from the street. And I think broadly he and a lot of firearms officers believe that there isn't amongst the public a huge understanding of the pressures of the job that firearms officers do, but perhaps that was illustrated during this 3-week trial and was enough to make up the minds of the jury, make those minds up very quickly to bring back that verdict within about 4 hours. I followed this trial. We can now show you some of the footage and that sense of almost chaos that ensues in the immediate aftermath of firearms officers getting out of their vehicles onto the street, confronting a suspect. But I should give a warning that some of the footage that you're about to see, some viewers might find a bit distressing.
On to New Park Road, continuing southbound. Pass, what's your ETA?
30 seconds.
Through South London, a convoy of police cars followed the suspect's Audi Q8. It had been linked to a shooting the night before.
Standing by for strikes, stand by, stand by.
When it turned into a side street, police launched a plan to stop it and remove the driver.
On to Coastal Gardens. Here, it's in line.
Boxed in, surrounded by armed police, the Audi rammed forwards.
Oh, police! Show me your hands!
Officers' body-worn cameras and dash cams caught the speed, the noise and the drama of what was happening.
Watch yourself.
The suspect's Audi drove backwards.
Mind them, he's going to try and go.
After 17 seconds, an officer fired one shot. The jury was shown a graphics version of the movement of the firearms officers. Blake is the yellow dot. He ends up in front of the suspect's car from where he takes the final shot. The officer said he feared the car would hit and kill one of his colleagues. He shot the driver in the forehead and killed him. The suspect was Chris Kaba, 24 and about to be a father. It wasn't his car. There was no weapon inside it. The next day, as police investigated the shooting, Mr. Kaba's distraught family went to the scene.
The report said that it was a pursuit. Where was the pursuit? He was boxed in. The pursuit where? You know, and why did they shoot him in his vehicle with the windows up? I don't get it.
Police!
In London and elsewhere, campaigners looked for an explanation. The superstar rapper Stormzy joined a demonstration outside Scotland Yard. 2 years later, Mr. Kaba's parents were at the Old Bailey to watch their son's killer in the dock. A rare thing, the firearms officer charged with murder. A court ban on his image, but not his name, Martyn Blake, aged 40. In court, the prosecutor said the officer had no reason to fire his gun. He'd given false statements and exaggerated the danger. Mr. Kaba, said the prosecutor, had ignored police shouts to stop, and that made the officer angry, frustrated and annoyed. The officer told the jury he felt none of that. He was filled with dread, he said, because the driver was trying to use his car to escape. He thought one of his colleagues was about to die, so he fired to incapacitate the driver and stop the car. In the wake of the Chris Kaba shooting, the Met Commissioner Sir Mark Rowley called for better legal protection for officers who use force on duty.
They are subject to the law like everyone else. There shouldn't be a double standard. I know the Commissioner's talking about extra protection for arms officers, but that, again, is sending the wrong signal. You cannot have one law for one set of people and another law for others. It has to be consistent.
Tony Long is one of 4 on-duty officers in recent times to be tried for murder or manslaughter. He shot dead a suspect in North London nearly 20 years ago. He was acquitted.
We ask those police officers to look after us. And so if we train them to use these varying degrees of force, ending up potentially with lethal force, then I think we should be not cutting them some slack, but we should have a better understanding. And you can't just automatically say, well, that police officer shot someone.
The jury has delivered its verdict on the shooting of Chris Kaba, but the debate over the police use of lethal force will continue.
And Martyn is still at the Old Bailey. And Martyn, your point there about this debate, it will certainly go on. And with that in mind, all sorts of reaction and statements coming out this evening.
Yes, we've had a few so far, and we're going to hear, I'm sure, from a number of other organisations. And you could probably see, Mark, behind me, there's a gathering of cameramen and many of our colleagues waiting for a reaction from Chris Kaba's family, or at least from their lawyers. But let me just bring you a statement from the Crown Prosecution Service, whose decision it was to charge Martyn Blake, only the 4th serving on-duty officer to be charged with murder after the fatal shooting of a suspect. This is what the CPS's Frank Ferguson, who's head of their Special Crime and Counter-Terrorism Division, said, "First and foremost, I want to say that my thoughts and those of the CPS remain with the family of Chris Kaba. Today, armed Metropolitan Police Officer Martyn Blake has been found not guilty of the charge of murder. We fully respect the jury's decision. This has been a complex and sensitive case, and the decision to prosecute was made after an in-depth consideration of all the available evidence. We recognise that firearms officers operate under enormous pressure, but it is our responsibility to put cases before a jury that meet our test for prosecution, and we are satisfied that test was met in this case. It is therefore right that the case was put before the jury for them to scrutinise and to decide. They have carefully considered each piece of evidence, including video and Martyn Blake's own account. They have made up their minds in the proper way, and we thank them for doing so." As I was saying, Mark, that's from the Crown Prosecution Service, whose decision it was ultimately to bring that charge, a rare charge of a police officer for murder. We've heard from the Met Police Commissioner, among those who are very relieved at this decision. But crucially, we hope in the next few minutes we'll hear from Chris Kaba's family or their lawyers. Chris Kaba's family, his mother and father who arrived here, we watched them turning up at the start of this trial, saying that they were hoping for answers, hoping for justice. Let's see whether they feel that justice has been done. I think we might better hear from them shortly.
All right, Martyn, thank you very much indeed. Let's get some more reaction now then. Let's speak to Leroy Logan, a former superintendent of the Metropolitan Police and former chair of the Black Police Association Charitable Trust. Good evening and thank you very much for being with us. And I just wonder, first of all, your reaction to the verdict.
Well, it's not a surprise because previous officers who have been in the dock for murdering, an allegation of murdering a person has not been found guilty. So I'm not surprised because you have to show intent, and the officer's account put that in doubt according to the jury, and he was found not guilty.
Yes, and it is that issue, I guess, of premeditation and malice aforethought that comes into these things. Yeah,
a lot of the times when someone is done for murder, charged with murder, invariably they have the fallback of manslaughter. So if they can't show intent, then the recklessness aspect comes in. And I would have thought a manslaughter charge would have been appropriate as well. You can actually put two charges to them, and it's for the court to decide which one is more applicable.
What did you make of what Sir Mark Rowley has had to say, basically saying no police officer sets out to take life? Sergeant Blake made a split-second decision and the jury decided the force used was reasonable.
Well, I'm not the most confident person in Mark Rowley. I don't think he's doing a particularly good job when it comes to issues of race. His leadership around not even acknowledging institutional racism does not in any way instill confidence from myself and many other members of the public, in particular the black community. So I was not totally confident in or reassured by what he was saying. I still think he's playing to certain communities within the organisation, you know, to ensure that they feel protected. But I think one of the things that I still maintain is you have to have a consistent legal system. You can't have one protection for some elements of the public or any profession, and then you don't have that for other members of the public. I think there needs to be more clarity, and I would like to think that they really need to look at the laws and how they can bring in certain elements that is agreed by the legislator. Similar in a way with doctors and the neglect issue. They're not always done for murder, but there is that issue around were they neglectful in carrying out their duties. But I think out of the things that I really have concern about Mark Rowley is when he conflated two issues around crushing officers and making people feel less safe. Now, officers, regardless if they're specialist firearms officers or officers on the beat, will know that they have to be proportionate and necessary in all their actions commensurate with the risk. And if they do stray over that and they are subject to misconduct and or the CPS think they should go to court, everyone, regardless of their specialisms, know that's a possibility. And especially firearms officers. They are trained, they know split-second decisions can be seen in the cold light of day as being unnecessary or disproportionate. And I think for him to try and bring those two issues to say, well, listen, you're crushing issues by just challenging them or even putting them before the courts, I don't think he should be making those emotive comments and relating it to safety on our streets. I think that was totally disproportionate and inappropriate as well.
Right. The other thing he said was, we know incidents like this place further strain on policing relationships. And he was talking specifically about with the black community, support is low within the black community. What will the black community make of this, do you think?
Well, we're not a homogenous group. There'll be different stances throughout black and minority ethnic communities. But I think, like everything, they will look at situations from Jean-Charles Menendez all the way through to Mark Duggan and then this case, and they think, well, minority groups tend to be on the receiving end of firearms officers' bullets. And they are thinking, is this justice when they are never convicted? And that's not going to reassure them. And then the comments of the commissioner is not going to reassure them. And they're going to think, well, you know, where is the chance for real justice? And I can see various people commenting around that. And obviously, there'll be people commenting that the officers were right in the circumstances. But I think that the CPS was right to bring the charge in those circumstances I've seen. I would have thought they would have brought in a manslaughter charge as well to be examined at the courts.
And just finally, Martin Brunt speaking at the end of what he was saying there about this debate of the lethal use of force by police officers. It's almost certain to continue now, certainly.
Yeah, and as I said before, they need to have some sort of clarity around the law and to ensure that we don't have this debate all the time about officers needing extra protection. I think that the optics of that, it sounds wrong and it's double standard. One of the things that we all have to rely on is the law is supposed to be consistent for everyone. Obviously, there's certain things that have to be clarified. And I think that clarity for firearms officers needs to be looked at in a similar way that doctors and issues around neglect. And obviously, these things will never be perfect, but we try and get the best legal system possible so that officers who go to court will not only be dealt with and justice seem to be done, as in this case, but more importantly, speed up the process. 2 years is a long time for the officer to be on hold. And obviously, the victim's family, Chris Kaba's family, having to wait for justice in this way.
Yeah. OK, Leroy Logan, appreciate your time this evening. Thank you for coming on.
You're welcome.
Right, well, there's already been some political reaction to this. Our chief political correspondent, John Craig, joins me now. And good evening, John. And I see that the Conservative leadership contender, Robert Jenrick, has been posting a statement on X.
And he has strongly defended Mr. Blake, the firearms officer. Mr. Jenrick has said that Martyn Blake, the firearms officer cleared today, he says was a hero who found himself fearing for his life and the life of his colleagues. Mr. Jenrick goes on to say his prosecution was wrong and endangered the public. The ordeal he's gone through unthinkable. And Mr. Jenrick says we must back our brave police officers, not drag them through the courts for making split-second decisions. That was shortly before the statement by the Met Commissioner a short time ago. A pretty swift reaction from Mr. Jenrick. It's worth recalling that when firearms officers downed their weapons, handed in their weapons, that was back in September 2023, there was a response at the time from the then Home Secretary, Suella Braverman. Now, she, at the time, ordered a review into armed policing, and she said that that was when dozens of officers in London handed in their weapons, saying they were worried about the murder charge against Martyn Blake. Now, back then, Suella Braverman, also writing on X, said, this is September 2023, she said, we depend on our brave firearms officers to protect us from the most dangerous and violent in society. in the interest of public safety, they have to make split-second decisions under extraordinary pressures. Sola Braverman went on, they mustn't fear ending up in the dock for carrying out their duties. Officers risking their lives to keep us safe have my full backing, and I will do everything in my power to support them. That's why I've launched a review to ensure they have the confidence to do their jobs while protecting us all. So there was criticism at the time of the decision by the CPS, Crown Prosecution Service, to bring about a prosecution. And now we have from Robert Jenrick, who was indeed a Home Office minister, now a candidate for the Tory leadership, saying that this prosecution was wrong and has endangered the public. We are awaiting a response to the verdict at the Old Bailey from the Home Office. If it was actually Home Office questions in the House of Commons earlier this afternoon, but that verdict came after they finished, so it hasn't. Well, there was no chance for it to be raised in Parliament. However, we are expecting comment, some sort of response from Yvette Cooper and the Home Office, but so far it's just Mr. Jenrick is the only senior politician to have responded, but we I thought it was worth recalling what Suella Braverman, who was Home Secretary back in 2023, said about the charge at the time.
OK, John, thank you very much indeed. And we're just getting a statement from the family of Chris Kaba, and they say they have been left with a deep pain of injustice after the marksman who fatally shot him was cleared of murder after the trial at the Old Bailey. So the first and early reaction of the family of Chris Kaba, saying they have been left with the deep pain of injustice. Well, our policing commentator, Graham Wetone, joins me now. Graham, we'll talk about the family in just a moment. I just wonder what you thought of Leroy Logan, if you heard him a little earlier, talking about disagreeing with what Sir Mark Rowley had to say on a number of issues, and was surprised that there was no manslaughter charge here. What did you make of that?
It seems a fair point. Again, it's a question for the CPS to answer. They obviously felt there was enough to put the charge of murder, which I was quite surprised at when that was first posted. But they obviously felt there was enough to charge the officer with murder. It's gone before a jury. The judge has directed the jury legally, and the jury's found him not guilty of that charge. And I think that's, for me, that's where it stands. I think that was the right decision, based on all the evidence and the facts that I've read about from this case.
Exactly, and this is where we are now. We've got Sir Mark Rowley talking about his professional force. He's humbled and proud of his officers, and he stands behind them. And then you have the family, as I was just saying, talking about this deep pain of injustice. I mean, we've been here before.
Yeah, again, there are no winners, there are no losers in case of this. The sad fact is that a young man has lost his life, and it was at the hands of a serving police officer on duty who has used force, lethal force, to take his life. That's now been judged in a court in front of a jury, and they've made their decision based on all the evidence and all the facts, which clearly we haven't gone through in the media or in news reporting. The jury have sat there through the whole trial and listened to everything. They've had all the reconstructions, they've listened to the expert witnesses, they've listened to the people that were there at the time, and they've formed the opinion this was an honestly held belief, and the force that was used at the time was lawful, and they've come to their decision. The sad fact is that there is still a family who are grieving for their son, and you can't get away from that. And it's as the Commissioner said, no police officer goes to work wanting to use lethal force in any stage, whatever you're doing at work. No one goes to work wanting to do that. Even when you're at work and you're faced with situations, it's almost like the last thing you want to do is to use force that may result in someone losing their life. So I think for the officer as well as the family, there's a conclusion to this, but I think that there's no winners here. No one's come out of this winning anything as such. I'm relieved for the officer. He's been found not guilty. I think that's the right and just decision. And I thank, again, the jury for going through it and taking their time, albeit that's quite a quick verdict to come back within 3 hours. So clearly the evidence was so conclusive that they'd come up with that conclusion that it was lawful.
Yeah, and they were dealing with what the prosecution said, clearly what the defence said, and the prosecution case was essentially that he misjudged the risk and exaggerated the threat. That's what appeared to come out on the prosecution side.
Yeah, I read some of that as well, and it's very difficult. The prosecution have taken their time to present their case. They've taken, almost a year or so to look at all the facts. Sergeant Blake had seconds. They were following a vehicle that had been involved in a shooting the night before. The briefing told them that the vehicle was involved in a shooting. There had been no firearm recovered. And there was also intelligence to suggest that this threat, this tension, this likely threat to life was ongoing in the local area. Then they pick that vehicle up. They don't know who's in it. They don't know if the firearm is still in the vehicle. So they make the decision to do an extraction, to forcibly stop the vehicle and take the occupant or occupants out of the vehicle. That's a very, very brave decision, because you don't know what threat you're going to face as soon as you actively stop that vehicle. So you're trying to box it in. And I think there was evidence as well during the trial that at some point, with the car going backwards and forwards, there was a potential at some point for the vehicle to have actually broken through. And the officers were out on foot in front of, and a vehicle is a lethal weapon. It's very, very challenging. It's very difficult. You have to make split-second decisions. And all the evidence has been listened to and has been rightly judged.
Graham, if you just bear with me a second, I just want to read the rest of that statement. We just had an early sign-off a little earlier. And his family have made the following statement saying, "Today we are devastated. The not guilty verdict leaves us with the deep pain of injustice, adding to the unbearable sorrow we have felt since Chris was killed. No family should endure the unimaginable grief we have faced. Chris was stolen from us, and this decision shows his life and many others like him does not matter to the system. Our son deserved better. The acquittal of Martyn Blake isn't just a failure for our family, but for all those affected by police violence. Despite this verdict, we won't be silenced. We are deeply grateful to everyone who has stood by us and fought for justice. We will continue fighting for Chris, for justice and for real change. Chris's life mattered, and nothing can take that away from us." So that is the family's statement. And Graham, I just wonder, I mean, this is a family deeply... Well, it's a very difficult night for the family, isn't it?
Yeah, they're going to be hurting, understandably so. They've waited for this trial to take place. They've clearly formed their own opinion as to what they wanted the verdict to be. As I've said, it's been judged by a jury. The jury have heard all the evidence and legally have come down, in my view anyway, have come down with the right decision and a just decision. That is justice. That's justice in front of a court of law, in front of a jury. It's exceptionally sad for the family to have to face this. But as I said, that there are no winners and losers here. The Commissioner's statement was interesting about how he felt humbled and deeply proud of the officers. That's quite positive. But he also mentioned as well in a previous statement that there needs to be more legal protection. I know you touched on this with Mr. Logan. And I think that the difference here is it's not having different rules as such. But I think we'll ask officers to face really difficult situations. Members of the public will not have to forcibly stop a vehicle with potentially an armed violent suspect inside it. And that's what we're asking these officers to do. We're asking them to put themselves at danger, at risk, potentially confront someone with a firearm and safely detain them. They are putting their lives at risk here. So when they actually have to use force, personally, I think they do need some greater protection from the law, some greater clarity around what they can and can't do. The honestly held belief is an opinion of the officer at the time, but then we're having to have it challenged in front of a jury. I'm not sure this officer will ever be able to return to full operational duties again. It remains to be seen what happens to him now, because there's still a police discipline process that potentially is still awaiting him. So that's a slightly different level of proof. So this isn't over for the officer or for his colleagues. So I think it does need looking at. I know the former Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, mentioned this, and the Commissioner touched on it. And I think that needs to be reviewed and looked at in the fullness of time, once we've got over this verdict that's come out today, and again, the impact on the family.
Graham, stay with us and thank you very much for that. Our crime correspondent Martyn Brunt joins me now from, once again, from outside the Old Bailey. And Martyn, just a reflection, if you could, on the family statement, calling it a failure for those affected by police violence. And also the decision shows, the statement says, his life does not matter to the system. And that is clearly what the family believe this evening.
Yes, they came here 3 weeks ago for the start of the trial, saying that they were here to get answers that they were looking for over the past 2 years. They were looking for justice, and clearly they feel that they haven't had any justice. They talked about the deep pain of injustice, and they vowed to carry on fighting for justice for Chris Kaba. We thought we might hear directly from them outside the court, and colleagues of ours were gathered there, have been gathered there for some time, but it looks as though the family have left by a side entrance. But there is a rallying call out from Chris Kaba family supporters for a protest here tonight, starting at about 7 o'clock. I just saw a post on Instagram that said, you know, everybody who's concerned about this verdict, who maintains an interest in fighting for Chris Kaba justice, should be here to make their protest, their voices heard. Officers should not be allowed to kill with impunity, is the view of the Justice for Chris Kaba group. So sometime tonight we expect some of those supporters at least to gather here. I've been following this trial over those 3 weeks, and we can now bring you what I've reported on, that verdict, and show you some of the footage that was shown to the jury. A number of police body-worn cameras and dash cam cameras caught those 17 seconds in which this confrontation played out. I should warn some viewers that there are images that show the moments before Chris Kaba was killed, and they might find some of that distressing.
On to New Park Road, continuing southbound, pass, what's your ETA?
30 seconds.
Through South London, a convoy of police cars followed the suspect's Audi Q8. It had been linked to a shooting the night before.
Standing by for strike, stand by, stand by.
When it turned into a side street, police launched a plan to stop it and remove the driver.
On to Coastal Gardens. Do it here, it's in line.
Boxed in, surrounded by armed police, the Audi rammed forwards.
Oh, police! Show me your hands!
Officers' body-worn cameras and dash cams caught the speed, the noise and the drama of what was happening.
Watch yourself.
The suspect's Audi drove backwards.
Mind them, he's going to try and go.
After 17 seconds, an officer fired one shot. The jury was shown a graphics version of the movement of the firearms officers. Blake is the yellow dot. He ends up in front of the suspect's car from where he takes the final shot. The officer said he feared the car would hit and kill one of his colleagues. He shot the driver in the forehead and killed him. The suspect was Chris Kaba, 24 and about to be a father. It wasn't his car. There was no weapon inside it. The next day, as police investigated the shooting, Mr. Kaba's distraught family went to the scene.
The report said that it was a pursuit. Where was the pursuit? He was boxed in. The pursuit where? You know, and why did they shoot him in his vehicle with the windows up? I don't get it.
Police!
In London and elsewhere, campaigners looked for an explanation. The superstar rapper Stormzy joined a demonstration outside Scotland Yard. 2 years later, Mr. Kaba's parents were at the Old Bailey to watch their son's killer in the dock. A rare thing, the firearms officer charged with murder. A court ban on his image, but not his name, Martyn Blake, aged 40. In court, the prosecutor said the officer had no reason to fire his gun. He'd given false statements and exaggerated the danger. Mr. Kaba, said the prosecutor, had ignored police shouts to stop, and that made the officer angry, frustrated and annoyed. The officer told the jury he felt none of that. He was filled with dread, he said, because the driver was trying to use his car to escape. He thought one of his colleagues was about to die, so he fired to incapacitate the driver and stop the car. In the wake of the Chris Kaba shooting, the Met Commissioner, Sir Mark Rowley, called for better legal protection for officers who use force on duty.
They are subject to the law like everyone else. There shouldn't be a double standard. I know the Commissioner's talking about extra protection for arms officers, but that, again, is sending the wrong signal. You cannot have one law for one set of people and another law for others. It has to be consistent.
Tony Long is one of 4 on-duty officers in recent times to be tried for murder or manslaughter. He shot dead a suspect in North London nearly 20 years ago. He was acquitted.
We ask those police officers to look after us. And so if we train them to use these varying degrees of force, ending up potentially with lethal force, then I think we should be not cutting them some slack, but we should have a better understanding. And you can't just automatically say, well, that police officer shot someone.
The jury has delivered its verdict on the shooting of Chris Kaba, but the debate over the police use of lethal force will continue. Martin Brunt, Sky News at the Old Bailey.
Let's go back to John Craig at Westminster. And John, I gather now we're getting some reaction from the government.
We have a statement from the Home Secretary, Yvette Cooper. More significant, I think, for what it doesn't say rather than what it does. There is no comment from Yvette Cooper about whether the CPS, the Crown Prosecution Service, was right or wrong to bring this case. Let me read you the Home Secretary's statement. She says, for 2 years since the death of Chris Kaba, this has been a very difficult case, causing deep concerns for communities, for police officers, and of course, causing real distress for the families most closely affected. The jury has come to a conclusion. Sergeant Martyn Blake has been acquitted, and it's imperative that's respected and everyone is given the space to process the verdict. Criminal prosecutions, Yvette Cooper says, brought against police officers for actions taken in the course of their duties are extremely rare. Each day, police officers across the country work hard with bravery and integrity to keep the public safe. The British tradition, she says, of policing by consent relies on mutual bonds of trust between the public and the police. It's important both that the police have the confidence of communities they serve and that officers have the support and confidence they need to do the difficult job of keeping us safe. The government is committed to working with policing to strengthen confidence for the future. Well, a very measured, restrained statement from Yvette Cooper, not really making any comment about the actual verdict, unlike Robert Jenrick, who earlier this afternoon said that the prosecution was wrong, and he called Martyn Blake a hero who found himself fearing for his life and the life of others. And Mr. Jenrick, who of course is a spokesman, a candidate for the Conservative Party leadership. There you have his statements on X there. But the key line in there is where he says his prosecution was wrong and endangered the public. Talks about the ordeal. We must back our officers. Well, the statement from Yvette Cooper, in contrast, is very even-handed. No real comment about the decision by the CPS to bring about this prosecution. You'll recall that back in September 2023, the then Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, ordered a review into armed policing. That was after dozens of officers in London handed in their weapons, saying they were worried about the murder charge. and at the time, the then Home Secretary Suella Braverman said that officers must not fear ending up in the dock for carrying out their duties. So we're hearing very different messages from the Home Secretary, the Labour Home Secretary, and a couple of former Home Office ministers, senior Conservatives, including Mr Jenrick, who, of course, is a candidate for the leadership of the Conservative Party.
Yeah, OK. John, thanks very much for bringing us up to date with that. Well, a little earlier, we heard from the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, Sir Mark Rowley. He gave this statement at Scotland Yard.
The jury system is the cornerstone of British justice, and today, after 2 weeks of evidence, 12 men and women have cleared Sergeant Martyn Blake of murder. Over the past 2 years, Sergeant Blake has paid a huge personal and professional sacrifice, and this has been an incredibly difficult time for him and his family, and he has acted with professionalism and dignity throughout. This case has had an enormous impact on many. Chris Kaba's family and friends continue to grieve the loss of a loved one, and today will be enormously difficult for them. Today's verdict is significant. No firearms officer sets out on duty intent on ending a life. Their sole purpose is the complete opposite: the protection and the preservation of life. Throughout the trial, the jury heard significant detail about the scenes facing Sergeant Blake that night. They were told that the car Mr Kaba was driving had been linked to a reported shooting the night before. The suspects were still at large, and no gun had been recovered. Armed officers bravely intervened, not knowing the risks that they were about to face. The court heard that Mr Kaba tried to evade police, ramming his vehicle into others all around him. Sergeant Blake made a split-second decision on what he believed was necessary to protect his colleagues and to protect London. The jury decided that was an honestly held belief and that the force used was reasonable. Any fatal use of force understandably prompts huge concern amongst communities, particularly in black communities where trust in policing is low. There remains much for us to do to strengthen confidence in our service, and we know incidents like this place further strain on already challenged relationships. No police officer is above the law, but we have been clear that the system holding police to account is broken. I worry about the lack of support officers face for doing their best. But most of all, I worry for the public. The more we crush the spirit of good officers, the less they can fight crime. That risks London becoming less safe. Our armed officers respond to more than 4,000 incidents each year, but there are only 1 or 2 incidents where shots are fired. It is undeniable that they are the most professional, most accountable, and most cautious in their use of lethal force in the world. Their operations have prevented countless acts of violence across our city. Last year alone, they removed more than 400 guns from our streets. I remain humbled and deeply proud of officers who continue to protect London despite all the risks that they face. They continue to have my full and my unwavering support. Thank you.
Sir Mark Rowley speaking a little earlier. Our policing commentator Graham Whetone is still with us. And Graham, I guess that is the type of statement you would expect from the Commissioner in these circumstances.
Yeah, I think it's very welcome. I think the firearms officers that carry firearms will welcome that statement, saying that he's humbled and deeply proud, and more importantly, they had his unwavering support. I think that's what's been lacking, or that's a feeling amongst police officers that has been lacking over the last few years, is that if you're sadly put in a position like this where you have to either use force ultimately use lethal force, that whether you're going to get the support from within the organisation, not just outside, but from society, from politicians, from the justice system, but primarily from your bosses, from the people in charge of you. They're the ones that are putting you out on the road. They brief you. They tell you what they want you to go and do, what they want you to deal with, the threat, the risks that you face. So you want their support first, and then hopefully the others will follow. So I think the Wordsman Commissioner will help alleviate some of that crushing he referenced that officers may have felt in the last couple of years.
Yeah, I mean, he makes that point, the more we crush the spirit of good officers, the less we fight crime. But on the other hand, of course, we've had the family statement saying they're devastated, a deep sense of a deep pain of injustice, they call it. And they make this point that the decision shows his life does not matter to the system. And that is going to be a view shared by others in the black community.
It is, as I said, I'm not sure there can't be any winners or losers in this. There's no winners or losers for me in this. There's, sadly, a man's lost his life at the hands of serving police officers. No officer goes to work wanting to use force, let alone use lethal force. There is always the option for someone to either pull over in the car, to show their hands, to comply with the directions given by a police officer when they use those commands. So, and you heard on the clips we've seen, lots of verbal commands to stop, show your hands, etc. And I think the Commissioner alluded to it there. Armed officers across the UK are probably the most they're held back that they can be. You look across the world. If you don't stop your car in other countries or start to drive away, it wouldn't just be one shot you'd be facing. So, I think we should recognise the bravery, the courage, the training, the professionalism of armed police officers within the UK. Sadly, on occasions, because of an honestly held belief, and the jury has looked at this and decided it was an honestly held belief, this was lawful, and that was the consensus from many I spoke to within the policing who knew basically the facts, the incident itself, the briefing, the knowledge that the officers had at the time. They felt this was lawful. It was a sad lawful use of force, but most other officers I spoke to said, if I'd been in the same position, I think I'd have done the same thing. And I think one of the officers who gave evidence said they were about to pull the trigger. So that's the decision-making process we've got to in this case. So it's a very sad set of circumstances, but at any time, you could stop your vehicle, you can comply with the directions, the orders, the instructions given by police.
Now, I just want to read, Graham, stay with us. I just want to read a statement from the local MP, Bel Ribeiro Addy, who says the officer who fatally shot Chris Kaba has been acquitted of murder today. In all of this, we must remember that a young man has lost his life. Today's outcome will be difficult for his loved ones. We must respect their grief at this time. And we must also respect the legal process and the fact that the CPS believed there was sufficient evidence to bring a murder charge. Whilst police officers undeniably have a difficult job and work under exceptional pressures, this trial shows nobody is above the law. When anyone loses their life after contact with the police, it is vital that this is properly investigated. And the statement goes on, the fatal shooting of Chris Kaba caused considerable fear, anger and pain, not only in our community, but in communities across London. Trust and confidence in policing has long been a problem in London, particularly within the black community. We need urgent efforts to rebuild trust between police and communities. So, Graham, we've only got a minute left, but I want to just ask you about what you think it will do to trust and confidence in policing in London.
I think inevitably it will impact it. It has to, because the verdict hasn't gone the way that some members of the community wanted it to. So clearly it's going to have an impact on trust and confidence. The police have even greater steps to take to try and rebuild that trust and confidence. But as I said, I think the instructions, directions, the advice you'd give is, if at any time you're being stopped by police, to follow their guidance and instructions. It will take some time for the police to rebuild what is already a lack of trust and confidence within some communities within London.
OK, Graham, thank you very much indeed. Let me just bring you up to date with what we know this hour. The police marksman who fatally shot Chris Kaba has been cleared of his murder. Sir Mark Rowley, the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, said Sergeant Blake, Martyn Blake, made a split-second decision and the jury decided the force used was reasonable. My force is the most professional force, the most accountable force, the most cautious force. I am humbled and proud of my officers. And the family has also issued a statement saying they are devastated with a deep pain of injustice, they say. They say it is a failure for those affected by police violence. And they say the decision shows his life does not matter to the system. That's the latest statement from the family, and we will bring it all together for you at the top of the hour.
I say, bring it on.
With America divided and tensions running high, get ready for an election like no other.
Join our teams as we follow the campaign trail as America decides.
We will win, win, win.
Get closer to the action this US election with full reaction and analysis.
Sky News, the full story first.
There's always more to the news than a headline. We want to discover, to delve a little deeper, to find out what's really going on. Explanation, analysis, the people at the heart of every story. I'm Neil Patterson, and this is the Sky News Daily Podcast. So, by the end, we'll hopefully all understand what's going on in the world just that little better. Available wherever you get your podcasts.
It's 6 o'clock. I'm Mark Austin. This is the News Hour. 60 minutes of news, analysis and interviews. We begin right now with the top stories this hour. Breaking news, a police firearms officer charged with murdering Chris Kaba is found not guilty. His family say the verdict leaves them with a deep pain of injustice. The 24-year-old was shot dead through the windscreen of the car he was driving following a police chase. The officer, Martyn Blake, told the jury he was only trying to stop the car, which police suspected had been used in a crime the night before. And in other news today...
Give us what you stole from us! Our phones, our skulls, our babies, our people! You destroyed our land!
Protest in Parliament. Charles and Camilla are heckled by an Australian senator.
This is not your land! This is not your land! You are not my kids! You are not our kids!
Plus, tell us how to fix it. The government launches a national conversation to help reform the NHS. Good evening. We begin with the breaking news that a Metropolitan Police firearms officer charged with murdering Chris Kaba has been found not guilty. Martyn Blake fatally shot the 24-year-old in Streatham, southeast London, in September 2022 after the Audi he was driving was pursued in connection with a shooting the previous evening. Sky's crime correspondent Martin Brunt has this report.
On to New Park Road, continuing southbound, past what's your ETA?
30 seconds.
Through South London, a convoy of police cars followed the suspect's Audi Q8. It had been linked to a shooting the night before.
Standing by for strikes, stand by, stand by.
When it turned into a side street, police launched a plan to stop it and remove the driver.
On to Coastal Gardens. Do it here, it's in line.
Boxed in, surrounded by armed police, the Audi rammed forwards.
Oh, police! Show me your hands!
Officers' body-worn cameras and dash cams caught the speed, the noise and the drama of what was happening.
Watch yourself.
The suspect's Audi drove backwards.
Mind them, he's going to try and go.
After 17 seconds, an officer fired one shot. The jury was shown a graphics version of the movement of the firearms officers. Blake is the yellow dot. He ends up in front of the suspect's car from where he takes the final shot. The officer said he feared the car would hit and kill one of his colleagues. He shot the driver in the forehead and killed him. The suspect was Chris Kaba, 24 and about to be a father. It wasn't his car. There was no weapon inside it. The next day, as police investigated the shooting, Mr. Kaba's distraught family went to the scene.
The report said that it was a pursuit. Where was the pursuit? He was boxed in. The pursuit where? You know, and why did they shoot him in his vehicle with the windows up? I don't get it.
Police!
In London and elsewhere, campaigners looked for an explanation. The superstar rapper Stormzy joined a demonstration outside Scotland Yard. 2 years later, Mr. Kaba's parents were at the Old Bailey to watch their son's killer in the dock. A rare thing, the firearms officer charged with murder. A court ban on his image, but not his name, Martyn Blake, aged 40. In court, the prosecutor said the officer had no reason to fire his gun. He'd given false statements and exaggerated the danger. Mr. Kaba, said the prosecutor, had ignored police shouts to stop, and that made the officer angry, frustrated and annoyed. The officer told the jury he felt none of that. He was filled with dread, he said, because the driver was trying to use his car to escape. He thought one of his colleagues was about to die, so he fired to incapacitate the driver and stop the car. In the wake of the Chris Kaba shooting, the Met Commissioner Sir Mark Rowley called for better legal protection for officers who use force on duty.
They are subject to the law like everyone else. There shouldn't be a double standard. I know the Commissioner's talking about extra protection for firearms officers, but that, again, is sending the wrong signal. You cannot have one law for one set of people and another law for others. It has to be consistent.
Tony Long is one of 4 on-duty officers in recent times to be tried for murder or manslaughter. He shot dead a suspect in North London nearly 20 years ago. He was acquitted.
We ask those police officers to look after us. And so if we train them to use these varying degrees of force, ending up potentially with lethal force, then I think we should be not cutting them some slack, but we should have a better understanding. And you can't just automatically say, well, that police officer shot someone.
The jury has delivered its verdict on the shooting of Chris Kaba, but the debate over the police use of lethal force will continue. Martin Brunt, Sky News at the Old Bailey.
Well, in response to the verdict, the family of Chris Kaba released a statement which said, "Today we are devastated. The not guilty verdict leaves us with the deep pain of injustice, adding to the unbearable sorrow we have felt since Chris was killed. No family should endure the unimaginable grief we have faced. Chris was stolen from us, and this decision shows his life and many others like him does not matter to the system. Our son deserved better." The acquittal of Martyn Blake isn't just a failure for our family, but for all those affected by police violence. Despite this verdict, we won't be silenced. We are deeply grateful to everyone who stood by us and fought for justice. We will continue fighting for Chris, for justice and for real change. Chris's life mattered, and nothing can take that away from us. Well, the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, Sir Mark Rowley, also gave this statement following the verdict.
The jury system is the cornerstone of British justice, and today, after 2 weeks of evidence, 12 men and women have cleared Sergeant Martyn Blake of murder. Over the past 2 years, Sergeant Blake has paid a huge personal and professional sacrifice, and this has been an incredibly difficult time for him and his family, and he has acted with professionalism and dignity throughout. This case has had an enormous impact on many. Chris Kaba's family and friends continue to grieve the loss of a loved one, and today will be enormously difficult for them. Today's verdict is significant. No firearms officer sets out on duty intent on ending a life. Their sole purpose is the complete opposite: the protection and the preservation of life. Throughout the trial, the jury heard significant detail about the scenes facing Sergeant Blake that night. They were told that the car Mr. Kaba was driving had been linked to a reported shooting the night before. The suspects were still at large, and no gun had been recovered. Armed officers bravely intervened, not knowing the risks that they were about to face. The court heard that Mr. Kaba tried to evade police, ramming his vehicle into others all around him. Sergeant Blake made a split-second decision on what he believed was necessary to protect his colleagues and to protect London. The jury decided that was an honestly held belief and that the force used was reasonable. Any fatal use of force understandably prompts huge concern amongst communities, particularly in black communities where trust in policing is low. There remains much for us to do to strengthen confidence in our service, and we know incidents like this place further strain on already challenged relationships. No police officer is above the law, but we have been clear that the system holding police to account is broken. I worry about the lack of support officers face for doing their best. But most of all, I worry for the public. The more we crush the spirit of good officers, the less they can fight crime. That risks London becoming less safe. Our armed officers respond to more than 4,000 incidents each year, but there are only 1 or 2 incidents where shots are fired. It is undeniable that they are the most professional, most accountable, and most cautious in their use of lethal force in the world. Their operations have prevented countless acts of violence across our city. Last year alone, they removed more than 400 guns from our streets. I remain humbled and deeply proud of officers who continue to protect London despite all the risks that they face. They continue to have my full and my unwavering support. Thank you.
So Mark Rowley there, and the Director of the Independent Office for Police Conduct, Amanda Rowe, said the following: "We appreciate this trial will have been of significant public interest, and particularly so within our black communities. The IOPC's role is to independently investigate the circumstances surrounding a fatal police shooting, including the decision to use lethal force. Under the law, firearms officers can use lethal force. However, it must be reasonable in the circumstances the officer honestly believed them to be." It goes on to say, ultimately, it is that jury's decision, having carefully considered all the evidence, to determine guilt or innocence, and we respect that decision and thank them for their consideration. Well, Sky's Shingi Mariiki joins me now from outside the Old Bailey. Good evening, Shingi. And, well, such a difficult case, this, for all involved.
Good evening, Mark. That's right. And I think what we have now across those statements by both the Home Secretary and the Met Police Commissioner is an attempt to quell community concerns. In fact, those statements, one of those, the Met Commissioner's statement, directly refers to the black community. And I can tell you that there is a protest organised for outside the Old Bailey within the next hour. We're expecting to hear from the campaign team who have supported the family, as a reminder to the fact that, yes, we have had a verdict after under 4 hours of deliberation today, but the impact and the anger among certain parts of the community will still be felt, and there'll be people here wanting to voice that. And another element that has been of interest today is the fact that the CPS have come under criticism for even bringing the officer Martyn Blake to charge. And we have a statement from the CPS off the back of the verdict, which I can read for you. It says that today, it says, "First and foremost, I want to say that my thoughts and those of the CPS remain with the family of Chris Kaba. Today, armed Metropolitan Police Officer Martyn Blake has been found not guilty of the charge of murder. We fully respect the jury's decision. This has been a complex and sensitive case, and the decision to prosecute was made after an in-depth consideration of all the available evidence. We recognise that firearms officers operate under enormous pressure, but it is our responsibility to put cases before a jury that meet our test for prosecution, and we are satisfied that test was met in this case. It is therefore right that the case was put before the jury for them to scrutinise and decide. They have carefully considered each piece of evidence, including video and Martyn Blake's own accounts. They have made up their minds in the proper way, and we thank them for doing so." And that statement touches on a number of aspects and elements, but over the course of the 3 weeks that this trial has lasted, the focus was on 17 seconds of frantic footage. The judge described it as a fast-moving, frenetic situation in which Chris Kaba, after turning into a residential road in Streatham, had his car jammed between police cars and also a car that was already on that street. He tried to reverse and move forward. Martyn Blake's version of events was that he felt that his colleagues were in danger. Therefore, he took the decision to shoot Chris Kaba. That bullet through the windscreen struck Chris Kaba on the head. He died of his injuries. The prosecution tried to argue that he was angry and frustrated at the time of the incident. Therefore, his judgment was impeded. Today, the jury decided that Martyn Blake was not guilty, but what we have now is a potential reaction from community who are angry about that verdict.
OK, Shingi, thank you very much. Well, politicians have been reacting to the verdict, including the Home Secretary, Yvette Cooper. She said for 2 years since the death of Chris Kaba, this has been a very difficult case, causing deep concerns for communities and police officers, and of course, causing real distress for families most closely affected. The jury has come to a conclusion. Sergeant Martyn Blake has been acquitted, and it is imperative that it is respected and everyone is given the space to process the verdict. Criminal prosecutions brought against police officers for actions taken in the course of their duties are extremely rare, she says. Each day, police officers across the country work hard with bravery and integrity to keep the public safe. The British tradition of policing by consent relies on mutual bonds of trust between the public and the police. It is important both that the police have the confidence of communities they serve and that officers have the support and confidence they need to do the difficult job of keeping us safe. The government is committed to working with policing to strengthen confidence for the future. And John Craig joins me now from Westminster. So, John, what other political reaction has there been?
Well, as well as the Home Secretary, we've heard from the MP for what used to be called the Streatham constituency. It's now called Clapham and Brixton Hill. That is Belle Ribeiro Addy. Unlike the Home Secretary, who Yvette Cooper's statement more significant for what it didn't say than what it did. No comment on whether the CPS was right to bring this prosecution or not. But Belle Ribeiro Addy, the local MP, comes down and says it was right that this prosecution was brought. Let me tell you what she said. She said the officer who fatally shot Chris Kaba has been acquitted of murder. In all this, we must remember that a young man has lost his life. Today's outcome will be difficult for his loved ones. We must respect their grief at this time. And then she says, we must also respect the legal process and the fact that the CPS believed there was sufficient evidence to bring a murder charge. Whilst police officers undeniably have a difficult job and work under exceptional pressures, this trial shows nobody is above the law. When anyone loses their life after contact with the police, it's vital this is properly investigated. And then she goes on to make a comment about the reaction. She says, the fatal shooting of Chris Kaba caused considerable fear, anger and pain, not only in our community, but in communities across London. Trust and confidence in policing has long been a problem in London, she says, particularly within the black community. We need urgent efforts to rebuild trust between police and communities. Now, the criticism of the CPS has come from Robert Jenrick. He is obviously one of the two candidates for the Conservative Party leadership. He did serve as a Home Office Minister. Mr Jenrick has said that Martyn Blake, the firearms officer cleared today, was a hero who found himself fearing for his life and the life of his colleagues. His prosecution was wrong, says Mr Jenrick, and endangered the public. The ordeal he's gone through, unthinkable. And Mr Jenrick concludes, we must back our brave police officers and not drag them through the courts for making split-second decisions. Now, it's also perhaps worth mentioning that what Suella Braverman, who was Home Secretary last year, what she said about the decision or the threat by armed police officers to hand in their weapons, saying they were worried about this murder charge. Now, she ordered a review at the time, and she said at the time, we depend on our brave firearms officers to protect us from the most dangerous and violent in society. She says they mustn't fear ending up in the dock for carrying out their duties. So she was more outspoken. Mr Jenrick's been outspoken, but a very even-handed statement from the Home Secretary, Yvette Cooper.
OK, John, thanks very much. I've got one more piece of political reaction to add to all that, and it is from the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, who says he understands the impact Chris Kaba's death has had and the anger, pain and fear it has caused. I respect the decision made by the jury today following the full examination of a large amount of evidence, including video from the incident. In London, we police by consent. When anyone loses their life following contact with the police, it's important that it's properly and thoroughly investigated, which is what is happening, or what's happened in this case. Firearms officers work under the most extraordinary pressure, Sadiq Khan says, carrying with them unique responsibilities and often putting themselves in harm's way to protect others. I understand the impact Chris Kaba's death has had on London's communities and the anger, pain and fear it's caused. I send my heartfelt sympathies to Chris Kaba's family, friends and the wider community. There's clearly, says Sadiq Khan, still a wider lack of trust in the police, particularly within the black community, that needs to be addressed. As Mayor, I will continue to work with the government to support and hold the Metropolitan Police to account to ensure any lessons are learnt, and the Met commands the trust of all Londoners as we build a safer London for everyone. That statement from the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan. And by the way, on this, coming up at 6:45, we'll speak to the president of the National Black Police Association. That's Detective Inspector Andy George. You're watching the News Hour. Coming up, we'll have the rest of the day's news, including the King is heckled by an Australian senator during an event in Canberra.
I'm Katie Spencer and I'm Sky News' arts and entertainment correspondent. When you think of Glastonbury, it's mud you want and music. They're going to cross to us live in a minute. Okay. Thank you so much. Brad Pitt is now a prolific producer behind the scenes.
It's not a mystery to me. We always were capable of doing this.
Oh, they're wonderful children as an audience.
Who did that?
Maverick here on the red carpet. I'm so excited, Tom Cruise. This is the story of the night.
It's the little independent film that could.
We take you to the heart of the stories that shape our world.
Nor have I ever struck any woman in my life.
There's this illusion of power.
Are you feeling well?
I remember covering the Oscars and that now infamous moment, the Will Smith slap. Nobody could quite believe that it had happened. You can tell from these crowds just how excited people are for the return of Pride.
These actors.
We're just going to break into that break because we are hearing now from the family of Chris Kaba.
And fought for justice. We'll continue fighting for Chris, for justice, and for real change. Chris's life mattered, and nothing, absolutely nothing, can take that away from us. Today is a devastating moment for the Kaba family, our community, and the nation. Martyn Blake's acquittal is painful proof that our lives are not valued by the system.
The fight for accountability, for justice and racial equity has spanned decades, and we honour all those who have contributed to that fight, those that came before us, whose shoulders we stand upon today. Despite this verdict, our commitment remains unwavering. For the Kaba family, justice was never about this verdict alone. They were clear from the beginning, this was always about more, about real systemic change that would have prevented Chris from being killed and that can prevent other people from being killed in this country by the police in the future. This is a fight that we as a campaign will not abandon.
This outcome reinforces the harsh reality that police can kill without consequence. No one can be safe while the police can kill with impunity. We stand with the families who lost loved ones before Chris, who are still seeking justice. This verdict is not the end. It only strengthens our resolve. Now is the time to join a fight for a future where justice and accountability are the norm, and no one is above the law.
Today, as a community, we are reminded that there is nothing for us in this criminal legal system. We have been shackled until now, told not to speak, not to talk about what the family was experiencing, not to jeopardize this case. Many of us who have worked on policing for years understood that there was very little faith we could invest in this court because it has never, ever produced a successful murder conviction of any on-duty police officer. Yes, there was a hope, potentially, that Martyn Blake could be the first because he shot Chris in the forehead. Now, if that's not an execution, I don't know what is. But since we can't rely on this system, we are forced as a community to continue to build our own alternatives, to build real safety, real peace, real justice, and really deal with harm and conflict in our communities because we cannot rely on police to do so. The only thing that the police deliver to our communities is pain. Pain and trauma that is inflicted upon us, and we will not stand for it. We haven't stood for it before, and we will continue to fight until our last breath, until we are in our graves. And from the afterlife, as ancestors, we will strengthen the next generation so that they can fight. Because unfortunately, we believe that our grandchildren will have to continue fighting. Our grandchildren will be fighting. We are the ones that are the children of those who fought before us. 53 years ago, almost to the day, Darcus Howe and the Mangrove 9 were on trial here in the Old Bailey. And they delivered a speech in there that no one has ever heard before. They told us on that day that this wasn't about the law, it was about humanity. Humanity. Who wants to live in a society where the police can shoot unarmed people in the forehead and be faced with no consequences? Martyn Blake didn't spend but a second in a handcuff, not a second in a jail cell, whilst our community, our youth, are locked up en masse under legislation like joint enterprise for things they have not done. It's very clear to us, especially as a black people, but for all poor people who are affected by these injustices, that our lives will never matter to this system. But it's fine. We matter to each other, we matter to ourselves, and we will fight for our rights. No justice, no peace. That's all.
Can I just get names?
So there we are, a statement from Chris Kaba's family there, saying Chris's life mattered and nothing can take that away from us. Martyn Blake's acquittal is painful proof our lives are not valued by the system, they said. Our commitment remains unwavering. We want systemic change. Our resolve is strengthened, but we had very little faith in the court. And they said that the police officer shot Chris in the forehead. If that is not an execution, I don't know what is. And this after the jury decided otherwise, and the police marksman who fatally shot the man you see there, Chris Kaba, has been cleared of his murder.
There's always more to the news than a headline. We want to discover, to delve a little deeper, to find out what's really going on. Explanation, analysis, the people at the heart of every story. I'm Neil Patterson, and this is the Sky News Daily Podcast. So, by the end, we'll hopefully all understand what's going on in the world just that little better. Available wherever you get your podcasts.
Let's just go back to our top story, and the police marksman, Martyn Blake, who fatally shot Chris Kaba, has been cleared of his murder. Shingi Mariiki is outside the Old Bailey, and Shingi, members of the Kaba family have just been speaking.
That's right. In the last few moments, we've heard from members of Chris Kaba's family. That campaign team fronted up by his cousin Shida, but also a group of campaigners as well, who've been supporting the family throughout this. And the tone of that statement was one of anger, in which they essentially rejected the verdict that came in the Old Bailey today, finding Martyn Blake not guilty of murder. But then they also evoked what they see as a systemic struggle, what they see as a long-running issue, what they see as a disproportionate use of force by the police against black people. There is something that they reflected on in that statement. They say that Chris's life matters, and that is important, and nothing will change that. And it's something that also links into statements we've had from other groups affiliated with the family today. We had a statement from Inquest, a group who support people who have lost loved ones at the hands of the police. They say that it is difficult to reconcile the verdict with the evidence heard at the trial and the shocking reality of an unarmed black man being shot in the head. They also then go on to say that we know that Chris's death is not an isolated case, but part of systemic racism and stereotyping. And I think that is why over the course of the afternoon we've had statements from authority figures trying to quell community tensions. In his statement, the Met Commissioner mentioned the black community and talked about the tension that it would cause among those people in and around London. But we also had Yvette Cooper put out a statement as well, talking about policing by consent and the importance of the relationship between the police and the public. And I can tell you, Mark, that in the next 30 minutes, that group are planning a protest here outside of the Old Bailey, rejecting the verdict. And we're not sure how many people will attend that protest, but what we do understand is it's a reflection of the anger that some people feel around the verdict. And yes, we've had 4 hours of deliberation and a court case finished, but what we have now is a group who are saying they are not going to stop protesting. They are going to continue because they see this as part of a wider societal issue, and therein lies the problem for the authorities who are having to deal with the fallout.
Yeah, and Shingi, where do they take this from now? They say, the family said, our commitment remains unwavering. We want systemic change. Where do they take this now, do you think?
Well, just judging off the back of the reaction 2 years back when I first covered this and when the shooting took place, there were protests out on the streets of central London outside New Scotland Yard attended by thousands of people. They'll be hoping that they can sling this back into the public arena in that manner. A number of people attended, from high-profile spokespeople from the black community and people from the world of celebrity as well, who saw this as a social issue that they wanted to get behind. So I think that's what the family and the campaign groups will be considering, is how they can keep this in the public eye and how they can continue to contest what has happened. And that will come in the form of a protest that starts here tonight, but then over the next coming few weeks and days, I think they'll continue to contest what has happened here today. And just coming back to the case itself, over the course of the afternoon, the jury went out at around 11:45 a.m. They came back at around 4 o'clock with their verdict, a not guilty verdict. This case centres around that frantic 17-second sequence in which Martyn Blake, after Chris Kaba turned into a residential street in Streatham, shot Chris Kaba through the windscreen of his car. He suffered fatal brain injuries and died at the scene. That incident has sparked 2 years of a process which has ended here for Martyn Blake with a not guilty verdict, but it hasn't ended for those campaigners.
OK, Shingi, thank you very much indeed.